It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristine Larsen, who has been an astronomy professor at Central Connecticut State University since 1989. Her teaching and research focuses on the intersections between science and society, including sexism and science and popular culture, especially the science in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and the history of science. She is the author of books Stephen Hawking, a biography, Cosmology 101, The Women Who Popularized Geology in the 19th Century, and Particle Panic, and Science, Technology, and Magic in The Witcher, a medievalist spin on modern monsters. Welcome, Kristine.
Thank you, Will. And just a note, please note the title is its own trigger warning for today. Tolkien's approach to female characters can perhaps best be described as complicated. Charges of misogyny have long been lobbed against both him and his works, although individual characters and situations have been argued as reflecting a more feminist perspective. Similar charges have been directed towards William Blake and his works. Lucy Cogan explains that Blake's more political works of the 1790s, quote, conflated sexual, political, and spiritual liberation and equated all forms of constraint on personal freedom with repression. In particular, he condemned social norms that prevented young women from openly and honestly expressing their desires and young men from sexual gratification. However, Blake's works included violent, non-consensual sex and rape as a recurring motif. Case in point is Oothoon, the central character of the 1793 poem Visions of the Daughters of Albion, described by various scholars as sexually frustrated, a helpless victim, and a libertine. James Heffernan summarizes her position as, quote, one of the most complicated, disturbing, and least readily assimilable figures in Blake's poetry. Ambiguity is also found in Tolkien scholarship concerning Aredhel and Oothoon, the White Lady of the Noldor. She is denigrated as rash and powerless or restless or frustrated. The circumstances of her marriage to Eöl, the Dark Elf, are classified as rape, seduction, and he, quote, more or less coerces her consent to marriage. Here I engage in a close tandem reading of these characters, examining the use of rape, enslavement, and objectification as plot devices. Aredhel misses wandering in the forests and wide lands as she had before coming to Middle-earth and wishes to leave the secret walled city of Gondolin, where her brother Turgon reigns. He eventually grants her leave against his better judgment, assigning escorts to accompany her to their brother Fingon's realm. Instead, she intends to visit her friends and kin Cilligorm and Curufin, sons of Fëanor. She is separated from her escort, but arrives at Cilligorm's territory while he is away. Welcomed by his people, she remains there, but eventually decides to explore the surrounding lands and becomes lost. The reclusive dark elf Eöl spies her, desires her, and traps her, and in Tolkien's infamous words, took her to wife. She bears him a son, Maeglin, whose movements, like those of his mother, are closely controlled, forbidden to interact with other kin. While his father is visiting the dwarves, Maeglin convinces his mother to leave for Gondolin, but Eöl follows them. Maeglin and Eöl are welcomed as family by Turgon, but are forbidden to depart in the name of maintaining the city's secrecy. Eöl prefers to kill his son instead, but Aredhel fatally takes the poisoned javelin, and Eöl is tossed from the city walls to his death. Maeglin remains as an honored sister son to the king, but secretly harbors an unnatural and unreciprocated incestuous desire for his cousin Idril. Captured by Melkor's forces on a secret trip outside the city in search of ores for his smithing, he buys his freedom with a promise to aid Melkor's attack on the city, in return for the possession of Idril. The city falls, but Idril and her son Eärendil are saved from Maeglin, who, as his father had foretold, suffers the same fate as his sire at the hands of Idril's husband Tuor. Visions begins with the maiden Oothoon wandering in Lutha's Vale, uncertain about plucking a flower that appears to also be a nymph. She is invited to pluck it and does, resulting in joy and confidence. She sets off to see her beloved, Theotormon, taking an impetuous course to his reign. She unexpectedly has a sexual encounter with a self-described slave master named Bromion, with Blake scholars alternately describing this as a rape or a consensual act initiated by Bromion or Oothoon herself. Afterwards, Bromion taunts her and Theotormon, claiming she is a tainted, pregnant harlot, exerting his power over them both. Theotormon responds jealously, binding them back to back in a cave. Oothoon seeks to cleanse herself of defilement, calling Theotormon's eagles to, quote, rend away this defiled bosom. While she emerges from the literal and symbolic darkness, embracing her renewed purity and uttering prophetic speeches decrying the bondage imposed by social norms, both men can only offer short laments. Theotormon is wrapped up in his own woes, stuck in the present, and the limitations of the senses and the sexual rules of society. Bromion is likewise permanently short-sighted, remaining defined by empiricism and a colonial focus on tangible resources. In response, Oothoon rails against Urizen, the embodiment of reason in Blake's mythology, and his religious laws, especially in how they are used to enslave women and force them to be wives and mothers. She curses her beloved Theotormon's having embraced a hypocrite modesty. But while she tries to cajole him every day, simply seeking to be the focus of his gaze, he remains mired, quote, conversing with shadows dire. And the Daughters of Albion can only, quote, hear her woes and echo back her sighs. In both works, a virginal maiden is unexpectedly engaged in a sexual encounter and waylaid from her original path. In both Bromion's treatment of Oothoon and Eöl's of Aredhel, especially in light of his blaming of the Noldor for Melkor's return, we can see echoes of the medieval practice of bride stealing, as well as the use of rape in Icelandic sagas as primarily a humiliation of the woman's male relatives. Bromion's claim that Oothoon is pregnant, if true, would have been taken as a sign that Oothoon was complicit, due to the long-standing popular belief that a child could not be conceived via rape. The same would be true of Aredhel. Additionally, some have argued that there is no rape of an elf woman in the legendarium, pointing to the statement in Morgoth's Ring, quote, but among all these evils, there is no record of any among elves that took another spouse by force, for this was wholly against their nature, and one so forced would have rejected bodily life and passed to Mandos. Now, Daniel Stride identifies several problems with this argument, including Tolkien's tendency to change his mind, and the fact that it says nothing about the rape of unmarried elves. Furthermore, in her seminal work on rape narratives in Tolkien's work, Lynn Whitaker argues that, quote, the threat or implication of coercive or non-consensual sex as a driving element is all is required to label a story as such. It is indisputable that Tolkien paints forced marriages in a negative light, but does not shy away from including them. Based on her analysis of the first three cases listed here, Clare Moore names Aredhel a victim of complex PTSD caused by, quote, a sustained amount of time spent under repeatedly traumatizing circumstances involving enslavement, rape, and forced motherhood. Slavery is a central theme in Visions as well, although it can be read in multiple modes. The poem proper, called The Visions, begins, enslaved the daughters of Albion weep, a trembling lamentation upon their mountains, in their valleys, sighs towards America. Albion is the Adamic figure of Blake's mythology, an old name for Britain. Blake critics generally note two primary readings of these lines: the Daughters of Albion, English women, weeping against their own political and sexual enslavement imposed by society, and or lamenting the slavery of Black women in the American colonies. Again, while Oothoon is not said to be married to either man in the poem, she is enslaved, literally chained to them, raped, possibly pregnant with her rapist child, and offered as a harlot wife to another man by her rapist. Labeling Aredhel's experience as rape is complicated by the lack of obvious violence in her story until her death. In the published Silmarillion, the coded term took to wife is used, although Tolkien uses stronger language in other versions. For example, in the early abandoned poem, The Lay of the Fall of Gondolin, Eol, quote, caught the white-limbed Isfil that she has ever since have been his mate in Doriath's forest, where she weepeth in the gloam. In a circa 1959-60 note, Tolkien states that, quote, Eol took her to wife by force, a very wicked deed indeed in the eyes of the Eldar, which leaves little to the imagination. However, the interpretation as rape is muddled in the eyes of some scholars and fans in Tolkien's rather convoluted explanation that, quote, it is not said that Aredhel was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. Now, despite the grammatical gymnastics in this statement, Aredhel apparently came to regard her life as hateful, similar to Oothoon's reaction to being chained to Bromion and Theotormon, quote, every morning wails Oothoon. What Brendan Anderson describes as, quote, the fairy tale's representation of rape or virgin horror, a direct threat of violence against an overcurious maiden who strays from the proper path, is clearly reflected in the consequences of both Aredhel and Oothoon's tale. Aredhel leaves the city against her brother's wisdom, and he forebodes that ill will come of it. She both strays from the appointed path of her brother, Fingon's land, and leaves the relative safety of Celegorm's people to explore the dark forest. Indeed, Lynn Whitaker specifically interprets Aredhel's, quote, unsated appetite for new desires and for male company other than her brother's as an awakening sexual curiosity and desire. Similarly, James Swearingen notes that the introduction, dubbed argument, of Blake's poem clearly reflects, quote, a young woman at the threshold of sexual experience, threatened by violence. Oothoon's active plucking of the flower, rather than being plucked, demonstrates her readiness for sexual relations on her own terms, including being the initiator of such relationships. Indeed, note the 8 uses of first-person pronouns in the brief argument. Like Oothoon, Aredhel's first speech in the Silmarillion uses 5 first-person pronouns in the first 2 sentences. In her next speech, she uses I once and my twice in one sentence. Clearly, Aredhel is depicted as a woman of agency at the start of her story, who is not afraid of proclaiming her desires to her brother and her male companions. Whitaker argues that since Aredhel was described as having previously engaged in roaming the countryside earlier in her life, hers is not by definition a transgressive desire. However, the woes that befall her can be interpreted as narrative punishment for her repeated resistance to male authority. Indeed, some scholars interpret the story as clearly blaming Aredhel not only for her own downfall, but for that of Gondolin itself. Clare Moore asks us to consider why another of Tolkien's independent elvish women, Luthien, is received so favorably, while Aredhel is more negatively considered. I argue that the difference is twofold. First, as Cami Egan affirms, according to Tolkien, quote, Beren and Luthien's position is unique and transformative for the story and future of Arda, while Aredhel's role at its core appears to be simply to explain Maeglin's dark disposition and thus his role in the downfall of Gondolin. Second, there is an important difference between the 2 women's first encounter with their husbands. It is Beren who enters Luthien's secret glade, a regular metaphor for sex. Aredhel subverts this by wandering into Eol's realm. She enters rather than being entered. Similarly, Oothoon enters Theotormon's reign willingly, boldly, via, quote, her impetuous course, and is subsequently raped by Bromion. While both women are painted as having agency early in their tales, in the immediate aftermath of their sexual encounters with their oppressors, they are increasingly viewed as objects, property, and slaves. For example, Whitaker points out Tolkien's use of the active voice with Eol as subject and Aredhel as object, and the lexical choices of command, must, and forbade to highlight Eol's control of his wife. When Eol is captured by the Gondolin guards, he claims the Lady Aredhel as his wife and explains to Turgon that his intent is to, quote, claim my own, my wife, and my son. Note that Maeglin is objectified here as well. Oothoon's body is also objectified by Bromion's rape, as he openly describes her as a commodity that is his to offer to Theotormon. But an important point is that Bromion does not take Oothoon out of desire, but rather to reinstate his supreme position in relation to another man, in this case, Theotormon. Bromion solidifies his power when, quote, storms rent Theotormon, initiating his jealousy. Mark Anderson interprets this as Theotormon being raped mentally, although Beth Ann Stevens, noting the similarity in the language, posits that this is actually a physical assault and perhaps even a sexual assault. Similarly, we see how Maeglin is essentially enslaved by his father, and later he is assaulted by Morgoth, but for the actions of Tor, he would have been a rapist himself against Idril. It is therefore useful to note that some Blake scholars interpret Theotormon as Bromion's son. Both works paint forced motherhood in a negative light. The poem vividly denigrates what Allen Ginsberg calls the, quote, hated children of forced marriage compacted terror scenes. Eowl's condemnation of Maeglin as his ill-begotten son effectively curses them both. Whitaker calls Maeglin double doomed as the child of rape for his father's part and under the curse of the Noldor for his mother's. In contrast to Maeglin, Tor and Idril's son Eärendil conceived of a loving consensual marriage with, quote, of surpassing beauty, for a light was in his face as the light of heaven, and he had the beauty and wisdom of the Eldar and the strength and hardihood of the men of old. While I have stressed Bromion and Eöl as the chief persecutors of our heroines thus far, it should be noted that Theotormon and Maeglin also play the role of oppressor. Both manipulate the woman in their lives and are described as unusually tied to their senses. They are also largely silent, having only one first-person speech each in their respective tales. In response, once Oothoon realizes that despite Theotormon's belief that she is defiled, she retains her purity, she launches into a passionate attack upon empiricist philosophy. Maeglin is named Sharp Glance by his father at age 12. Quote, for he perceived that the eyes of his son were more piercing than his own, and his thought could read the hearts beyond the mist of words. He attempts to read his mother's unguarded mind and discover the location of Gondolin. But his own words were few, save in matters that touched him near. On several occasions, when his father or uncle speak to him, he is described as watching or listening, but saying nothing in return. He is even silent when observing his mother take a fatal javelin for him, and his father is tossed off the walls of the city to his death. Like Theotormon, his desire is linked to sight, especially in the case of Idril. Yet despite the manipulation that these two women endure, they claw back some level of agency. Emerging from the darkness of Bromion's violence and Theotormon's jealousy, Oothoon declares herself pure. In rejecting what they told me, the external restrictions of the moralistic society, despite the fact that she remains bound in Bromion's caves, she nonetheless speaks the language of triumphant independence. We can likewise see Aredhel slowly reclaim some of her metaphorical light. In her heart, she gives her son a name in the forbidden tongue of the Noldor. And when her husband is away, she tells Maeglin stories of their kin and deeds in Eldamar. Tolkien explains how, quote, in the telling of these tales, there awakened in Aredhel a desire to see her own kin, and she marveled that she had grown weary of the light of Gondolin and the fountains in the sun. Note the return to active words such as desire and marveled. It is true that Maeglin initiates their escape to Gondolin, offering that they are held in bondage, but Maeglin is not forcing the desire for freedom into Aredhel's mind, but rather giving voice to what is already there and giving her permission to embrace it by aligning it to his own desires. Aredhel shows agency in saving her sons' and husbands' lives in the short term in Gondolin. It is they who ultimately doom themselves. In the end, Tolkien's authorial choice is to kill Eöl, Aredhel, and Maeglin for their respective transgressions against societal norms. But was Aredhel's death necessary for the story to retain its narrative power? Carolyn Jackson Holston reflects on how Blake's literary representation of rape, quote, can be compared favorably with other examples where the shame can only be expunged by the victim's death, a scapegoat, or partially assuaged by her transfer to the possession of her aggressor. Neither actually happens to Oothoon in the end, while both are Aredhel's fate. Harriet Kramer Lincoln reflects how Blake scholars often blame the author for, quote, Oothoon's shortcomings. Too engendered by his time to conceive of a truly liberated woman, he does not make Oothoon powerful enough to change her situation. I would argue the same is apparently true of Tolkien and Aredhel. William Blake's visions of the Daughters of Albion is ultimately concerned with the question of what it is to be a woman in a world ruled by men and governed by male-instigated norms. Crucially, it is Oothoon's body that is the site of contestation throughout the poem. The same is unfortunately true of Aredhel's life story. Thank you.
A stellar start to our last set of papers. Thank you so much, Kristine, for coming and talking to us about Tolkien and Blake. There seems to be like some kind of like key figures that we can really draw on and make those comparative studies with. So it's just continuously enriching our picture. Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions for Kristine? No? Okay, so we do have a couple of questions online.
Okay.
So one's asking if Tolkien was perhaps familiar with angelology and like spiritual warfare. So the idea of the afflicted kind of experience effectively demon rape, and there's any potential connection with what you've been talking about.
That is definitely beyond my expertise, although he's very clearly, I think, sometimes a banana is just a banana. And she, in the common vernacular, was taken against her will. There was no consent. She was raped in body and essentially forced to have a child. And so I'm going to lay that on the table.
No, fair enough. Yeah, of course. Okay, popping back into the room just in case we have any questions here. Yep.
Thank you, Kristine. That was absolutely amazing. I had a bit of a question. This might sound a bit weird.
It's Blake. It's not weird, as you proved to us in your earlier talk.
I don't actually agree with this idea of Blake being too engendered by his times to conceive a truly liberated woman. I mean, this is 1793. This is a fantastic poem. I wondered whether Tolkien and Blake are dealing with like ideas of trauma and PTSD differently. Whether Tolkien is like the ultimate way to get over something is basically to die or to be killed, to be released in that way, and whether Oothoon is more of a kind of, I know my trauma, I'm chained to it, but that doesn't change who I am, and whether it's actually more of a kind of different idea of how they're seeing trauma rather than different types of liberated women, if you like.
Yeah, and as we've talked, you get 10 Blake, and I'm not a Blake scholar, but you get 10 Blake scholars in a room and you will have 10 opinions on everything. So yes, in doing work for this paper, I certainly read many different interpretations of, is she a failed prophet? Yes or no. They don't agree on that. So yes, there are many different ways of reading this. And in my own reading of all of this, I was struck with what I saw were similarities of people saying, oh, but he was a man of his time. He wasn't, but he was. And I was seeing that under both the Blake scholars, and we have always famously seen that among the Tolkien scholars. And in just looking at Aredhel, the incredible similarity and contrast of her with Idril. If you want to see Tolkien writing a, quote, liberated woman in the same story, she is there. So why does Aredhel, why is the woman, we have the woman who is almost raped. Why do we have the woman who is raped, the one who has to marry her rapist and be forced to have a child and die? And the contrast in the same family is incredibly stark.
Thank you. Moving back online, we do have a question here about, so I wonder if you might have thoughts about the text treatment of Miriel and how some fans blame her for Fëanor's flaws and actions.
It's a similar sort of blaming the victim that you get in certain quarters of, and part of it is, do you blame Tolkien for writing it that way? Because again, we can't get into his brain and get what he meant at that moment in time when he was writing it, which is, the whole thing about authorial intent. But the way we can only go by how it was written, and what he wrote about Miriel. She said, I've had enough. I put everything into giving this son, and I'm out of here. Sayonara. So do you blame her? There are people who blame her for not being strong enough to stick around to raise her son. And in that way, perhaps she might have turned him around. But knowing what we have at least seen of him, could anybody have stopped Fëanor from being Fëanor? Could anybody literally say Fëanor no, and he would listen? And I would say the answer is no.
No, Fëanor.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Kristine. We do need to move on to our next speaker. So can we please give Kristine a massive round of applause?